Good morning. Hello, everybody. Hopefully you can hear the sound of my voice on this Google Hangout. Just going to wait for a thumbs up. Whoops, I think we just had an accidental muting there. I'm going to rewind a little bit here because I like this slide a bit. Sorry about that. We're using Google Hangouts, which is a wonderful free product with a low environmental footprint, but occasionally it does odd things like muting us mid-sentence. So I was just saying that one of the reasons we like to do this as an online event rather than an in-person event is that we think it saves a lot of waste. We think we're saving at least 270 tons of CO2 just on the travel. So hopefully we can continue to explore other modes of online conferences in the future so that we can lower our industry's carbon footprint. Now, that's only one form of tangible impact that we have here. The other is we're trying something new this year. We're trying to ask folks to make a voluntary donation to their favorite environmental causes in the name of our event. We are a free, unsponsored event, so this is one way we can all show appreciation to our speakers. And I'm glad to say this has worked out pretty well. Most of you did give. We think we've raised at least $9,000 last time I checked. And now about 1/3 of you did tick the box saying that you'd give later, not ahead of the conference. So perhaps you're waiting to see the value of the event. Well, we hope that the value you get today does motivate you to make a donation later on. And remember, that money's not going to us, it's going to whatever causes that you deem appropriate. And of course, we also get a lot of students joining us today, and we don't ask them to give. So finally, a few logistical points. This whole thing is on YouTube, of course, so you can do a live rewind, I think backwards about 4 hours. And then the whole event will also be saved and kept on YouTube thereafter. I'll do an edit in the next couple of weeks, so you'll be able to just dial into whichever talk you want to rewatch. There are frequent breaks between talks. Most of them are 5 minutes. We have some longer breaks through the day. Given the nature of the event, we don't really expect people to sit down and watch the whole thing in one go. So take advantage of that YouTube channel and watch at your leisure. The main communication and interaction spot here is Slack. If you did buy a ticket, you would have got an invitation to our Slack channel. And that's where we're going to be interacting with each other, with the organizers, and some of the speakers are going to be hanging out there as well to do their Q&A and just to take part generally. We're pretty active on Twitter as well. Our official hashtag is SustainableUX, so shout that out. And that's it for logistics. Any issues that you have during the day, any bad connectivity, do let us know there in the Slack channel. So now it gives me a great deal of pleasure to welcome our first speaker of the day, Joe McLeod. as well as being an experienced practitioner and UX leader. Hello, Joe. I was just about to say a sentence about you. As well as being an experienced leader, he's the founder of the Include Design campaign, which brought UK's leading designers together to defend creative education. He's currently working on a project called Closure Experiences, where he talks, consults, and writes about endings. And his book, Ends, challenges the impacts of consumption and shows what we need to do to create coherent endings for our products, services, and digital experiences. And it's on sale now in all good online bookshops. Welcome, Joe.
Thank you. So I'm just going to open my deck and share that now. Hopefully you can see that.
Not yet.
So,
not yet.
We
can't. No, we can see your avatar so far.
Okay.
So you should just have to hit that screen share button there.
Unmute, hide participants, turn camera on.
It's over on the left-hand side. There should be a little green screen share button.
Got it.
And then you can share just the application of the whole screen. Yeah. Awesome. Yeah, we see it.
There we go.
Excellent. Thank you.
Okay. Right, after that little interlude, yeah, I'd like to talk to you about ends. So actually, many years ago, I had a couple of experiences which made me think very differently about endings. So I was experiencing a product called Wildfire, which was on Orange, which was a mobile phone operator. And it was a voice avatar sort of, and it would handle all your phone messages long before smartphones when people left voice calls. And it promised to be all sorts of wonderful organization. So I'd be able to interact with it through voice and speak to it and ask it to play my messages. But really, Wildfire was hopelessly disappointing. It couldn't hear me properly, so it would always respond to me with, "Sorry, I don't understand you. Sorry, I don't understand you." And it was so frustrating. I began to feel like I wanted to get real satisfaction in ending it. I didn't want to just leave it and the usual sort of service ending. I wanted emotional satisfaction, a conclusion. I wanted to throttle it. It was so horrible. Another thing I was doing at the time was teaching, and this was in way back sort of 2004 or 5. And I set, I guess, a cliche project to a bunch of design students, and we all went away, and then we all came back with more things in the world. This brief was about waste and rubbish, and the answer to the brief was we created more things. And this vocabulary and this lack of ending, I found really interesting, but also very disappointing that we didn't have a language for ending and offboarding consumer experiences. So over the last decade or so, I've been looking into this. And in the last 2 or 3 years, I left my job and have been doing it full time, like looking into ends, sharing. I wrote a book on it, and I've been traveling all over the place, talking and sharing this idea with people. I found it super interesting and want to share it with you now. So let's talk about endings. Right, any consumer experience can be broken down into 3 stages: onboarding, usage, and offboarding. And if we map that onto the engagement model of the consumer, we can see 3 sort of starting experiences as we onboard to a consumer experience through advertising. We get told a story, marketing orientates us, packaging reveals that product experience, T's and C's, make an agreement about the story that we've been told. We then enter a period of usage, and over a period of time, we get a little bit bored of that product or service. And maybe as a provider, we add new product services to our portfolio, and we all get a bit bored. And the experience starts to become very dull at the offboarding. We forget it. We're too excited getting back to a new starting experience. So we experience these things as emotional death. Or sometimes we're not allowed to, these things linger on forever in our homes, in our society. And sometimes we're not allowed to leave things at all. It's very much overlooked, this part of the consumer experience. But this goes back way in our history. This isn't just a modern occurrence. Let's think about what life was like long, long time ago, hundreds of years ago. Imagine yourself digging up mud in a field. It was cold, it was grim, you were hungry, impoverished. Disease was rife. Death was a common occurrence. Everyone around you's dying all over the place. You had a rich vocabulary about it, and you believed in all sorts of principles around death because you wanted to get to heaven. Now, heaven in many religions offers similar sorts of aspects. So it has abundance, it's warm, it's friendly. These sort of things in high contrast to the life we were leading then. So we were desperate to get there. And to get there, we followed very explicit and meaningful rituals. And our funerals and the way we died were really important. But then the plague came along, 1347, decimated most of Europe. A third of Europe's population died within 3 years. Death became everywhere, and death became meaningless. And at the time, the Catholic religion was the dominant religion in Europe. And they were also there was a lot of corruption going on with the things called like indulgences, which was the Pope allowing people to sin if they gave money to the church. The church was getting enormously rich because many people were dying and leaving their estates to the church. So there was a lot of questions around the Catholic religion, and also a lot of challenging religions coming up. One of those challenger religions was the Protestants. Now, the Protestant uprising happened, and they had some different aspects to how they believed people should worship and believe in God. One of those was fasting. Now, in most religions, organized fasting is a part of that religion. So we'd have a period of time over the whole year where we'd fast and give thanks to having abundance. But in the Protestant religion, it was removed very early on by Martin Luther. This, to a certain degree, has lost our skill of having abstinence and relating to fasting. Another aspect in difference between the Catholic religion and the Protestant religion was jobs. Now, jobs in the Catholic religion, the valuable jobs were the Pope, a priest, or a nun. All other jobs weren't so rich. But in the Protestant religion, you could do any job, whether you're an accountant or a carpenter or an interaction designer. They were valued because you were doing it in the right way. So it's the beginning of our career path. Also, investment was allowed in the Protestant religion. And if you'd done good investment and looked after society, then your business tended to get more money. And if you became wealthier and your business became more productive, you could give your employees more money. And they made a decision then. Should I work less time or should I buy more stuff? Now, the Industrial Revolution had started to provide more stuff to buy. And so we started to buy in abundance. And at the same time, in medicine and science starts to push back on death. Mortality rates drop. And our experience of death as witnesses and watching our dying loved ones is getting pushed away as we relinquish that control to sort of services. So things like hospitals and hospices. Our experience of death as a witness becomes more distant. And this removes our experience and provides us this opportunity to consume a heaven-like abundance on earth without experiencing ends and having a distance from them. So where we had this rich and valuable vocabulary around endings, we now end up in this where they're hidden, overlooked, and unwanted. So you're probably thinking, my God, this is quite, what are we doing here talking about all this stuff? What's that got to do with UX and sustainability? Well, actually, it's very interesting. So I'm going to tell you about some modern endings that I can give you a bit more of a context around. So let's look at those. Let's look at printer ink cartridges, for an example. My printer tends to run out of printer ink every 5 minutes, it seems. And as it does that, I've gone out and I've bought a printer ink cartridge, and I brought it home, And I open it up and transfer it. And I'm standing there with a printer ink cartridge thinking, what shall I do with that? I can't chuck it in landfill, it's highly toxic. How do I recycle it? And I'm thinking, well, I'm sure it has some information on the back of the pack. So I look on the back of the pack, but no, it has 2 bits of marketing material which suggest I start a new relationship with them. Then I think it's also got this word zerdandothol, which is a dense chemical which is really bad for the environment. Knowing that isn't actionable to me in that context. What I need to know is what I should do with this printer ink cartridge. So I go online, and actually this company, this printer ink cartridge company, has been having a very good offboarding or recycling program for many years. And I have to fill in a form and then get this envelope sent to me, in which I can then send this cartridge back to them. Now, in this experience, I've had to find an offboarding experience, which was hidden from me. I've had to action that offboarding experience and create that whole aspect myself. Otherwise, I would have been left with loads of printer ink cartridges. Now let's look at another product, the consumer electronic industry. This is HTC One's mini packaging from a couple of years ago. Now, when we look at the packaging, especially of consumer electronics, it looks very idealistic, heavenly almost. It says boldly on the back, eco-friendly packaging, 98% recyclable. It's printed with soy ink. I'm feeling very good about this. But none of this relates to the offboarding experience or the end of the product inside, which on average is 18 months, it seems. There's only one aspect on here which talks about that. Now, this little wheelie bin icon, which I'm hoping you can see there, which suggests to the consumer, don't put it in the bin. And as I pointed out earlier, and I'm sure you know, you can't have an unactionable action. So don't do something isn't a button we'd be creating. This actually isn't just that. This is the we directive symbol. And I've been asking this, if anyone recognizes that symbol as the we directive symbol on every conference I've done. Nearly 5,000 people, I think I've asked in the last half year I've been talking. Now, if we don't know about this, that's a big problem, because this symbol allows me as a consumer to take back any consumer electronic, give it to the seller or reseller, and they take it back into the ecosystem, the manufacturing ecosystem, and dismantle it appropriately. But if the consumer doesn't know that, what's the point? That offboarding experience is hidden again. And even with more recent digital industry, where we're encouraged so much to create content and share content, we're also making mistakes here, where if I create something and I have no control over it at the later stages, then is there any surprise that something like revenge porn starts to emerge? 1 in 10 young women are threatened with it in the US. So this is a problem across all of the consumer landscapes, whether it's in products or services or digital. But why do emotional endings? Well, actually, we've been doing emotional endings in all sorts of other narrative structures for many years, and they're very, very valuable. Our stories, our theatre, our films all have very compelling and very important things that happen at the end. They create meaning. Elizabeth MacArthur, for example, says about endings in narratives, attempts to preserve the moral and social order which would be threatened by endlessly erring narratives. Now, I think about that in relationship to mis-selling and financial services, and I think there is a moral and social order which is disrupted by not having a conclusion to that. And then when we look at this one, solid closure and conventional narratives and histories satisfies this individual and social desire for moral authority, a purposeful interpretation of life, and genuine stability. And then I think of that and what we've been doing with carbon and climate change. And I think of the lack of stability, the challenge to life that that's going to bring, and the disruption to moral authority. So let's look at that in a consumer context and how the beginning has been drifting away from the end for many centuries. So imagine back in the 15th century, consumer experiences and your relationship with waste and closure were actually very closely knitted. Your experience of what you consumed and the waste from that was very close. So what was on the kitchen table, the waste of which could be fed to the animals. And the waste of the animals could be then put onto the field. This was a circle that we could see, we understood, it was actionable at every point. And the consumer experience and the conclusion and the closure experience were very coupled. But two things have been happening over those centuries. We've had a quickening of consumption, which has also tethered our identity, firstly through banking, with identities for credit, and then more recently through emotional identity, through things like likes and emotional alignment with brands. At the same time, we've been distancing ourselves from waste and the aspect of waste that is controllable and understandable and emotional to us. Let's look at those things. So quickening. Products start to be manufactured at scale in the Industrial Revolution. Department stores start to allow us to see things which are gathered together instead of going to all sorts of tradespeople. And modern advertising allows us to have a dream and understand what we're doing and have an aspect of like, I want to purchase this to fulfill my dreams. Progressive obsolescence allows me to throw away items before they're worn out or broken, just because I might want a new one. Banking allows me to grab credit now. And so with this, I can start to understand, like, afford all sorts of things. We create a whole new landscape with the World Wide Web. One-click shopping introduces that as a faster process. And obviously the click is a whole back end to that, which is quite innovative. And the type of things we're consuming now isn't just a product or a transaction or a financial obligation, it's a social thing, and we're sharing all sorts of content. So at the same time, we distance ourselves from waste, and this starts the Industrial Revolution again. As we start to manufacture things as an individual, I start to lose control of the waste I create in the industrial machine. My understanding of what waste is getting challenged by things like the concept of germs, something which is invisible, uncontrollable for me as a consumer. And I start to have real problems understanding that. It almost professionalizes waste. The things that we create, the chemicals we create, things like Silent Spring with Rachel Carson, we realize that they can go into the food chain and really challenge the consumer. And things like going to the moon wasn't just about us getting to the moon. We turned around and saw the Earth as a vulnerable thing in space. This made us think about how important it was for us to look after the Earth, and it kickstarted the Green Revolution. The Intergovernment Panel on Climate Change, created 1988, and we're still questioning the offboarding of carbon with climate change. And even the biggest systems that we create on Earth as humans, we can deny an ending to when we say things like too big to fail with toxic banks. We don't even know how to unravel a thing we've created ourselves. And I'm sure many of you have tried to calculate your carbon footprint, and it's nearly impossible to do it accurately, right to the nth degree. And finally, right to be forgotten with allows us to start to take ownership of the things we create online. But it's super hard to embed that if we don't create interfaces that allow us to offboard the content that we've created. So reflecting on these two things again, we see this quickening of consumption as tethering of identity begins, and it creates enormous emotional noise where the idea of waste and endings and offboarding has been distanced and faded. So where we had this close coupling in the 15th century, it's broken apart now. It's created almost a psychosis amongst us, where we've had a consumer self is delighted to take consumer experiences and enjoy them, yet a civil self challenges about waste and closure and is concerned about the environment. These two people can live in the same body, where I can happily buy a ticket for a flight across the world, yet at the same time I can go on Facebook and make a load of noise about plastic waste in the sea. These two things don't really come together in the consumer experience. The noise of which is for the onboarding, the message, the shouting that we hear about onboarding is overwhelming, and it's drowning out that civil self around offboarding and responsibility. We see this reflected in something as simple as our homes. The average US household has 300,000 things in it, from paper clips to ironing boards. And the reflection of this and the amount of consumption we're still doing and we can't stop becomes an enormous burden for the buildings that we have. So we start using off-site storage. Off-site storage, the construction of these new buildings is starting to accelerate quite a bit in the last few years. Let's look at sustainability in more detail and why I think it really needs an ending. So this is a urinal. It's in Helsinki at a conference centre. And it says boldly to the user of the urinal, this urinal is 100% ecological and saves at least 100,000 litres of fresh water per year. Now, looking at this, I think, well, that's a great sentiment. However, it's presented on a backlit screen, which is powered all day. And I think to myself, that's a lot of power going into that. And I don't really think it balances out. I dig into the business model of the company, Urimat, and they're going to push advertising through this screen while people at the urinal. And it makes this strange oxymoron of this urinal, which is very ecological, apparently 100% ecological, yet it's going to sell people all sorts of things through that medium. And this is the convoluting, strange place we're in, where we've only got one story left to tell. And this is the story of carry on consuming, because we've lost the story of abstinence. And we've lost that vocabulary of endings. So the only place we can create the noise to be listened to is by telling ourselves that consuming is the best way out of sustainability. This is sort of reinforced by William McDowell and Michael Brambert's book in Cradle to Cradle, which I think is a really admirable book, and they do some fantastic work in the manufacturing component of the consumer life cycle. However, I found the book overlooks aspects of consumption in terms of a consumer experience. And with that, we start to sell ourselves into the routine of consumption that we're currently in. We tell ourselves, and we're using the language, which quite honestly has been used for hundreds of years to sell something new. We're using the language of the new processes, new materials, new products. And we're at risk of creating an environment which sells sustainability and circular economy type products, potentially as Black Friday deals when they're not getting shifted enough. This again would be the oxymoron of sort of sustainability and wouldn't, in my opinion, be the right method. We also experience this with corporate social responsibility, where as a consumer or a person in society, I need to purchase something so it allows a company to action environmental improvements. as a proxy for me. It pushes the consumer onboarding and distances my individual responsibility for offboarding. Where I could have an experience about offboarding and an actionable role in that as a consumer, but hiding it behind corporate social responsibility, such as things that we used to do with carbon offsetting for flights, where I could click a box and then have an opportunity to rebalance that. And this circular economy is lacking a consumer ending, in my opinion. So where we have a whole life cycle, which is based on the system life cycle, which is manufacturing, assemblage, and presentation to the consumer life cycle, we know very familiar. Onboarding, usage, and there we're missing offboarding. So let's look into that a bit more. As I purchase a product, and if I'm looking towards a sustainable purchase, I'm looking to buy a circular economy product. And I want to buy that product from a company which has great CSR policy. And I'm hoping that product is made of safe and nutrient-rich materials. And at that point, I've had to consume to move forward with my intention to have a good sustainability. Once those products are purchased, where do they drift off to? They're going to go into my usage, and then at some point, they're going to have to be offboarded. Now, I'm also told to reuse things to get the best use out of them. I agree, that would be great. I'm also told I can repair things to get also a long use out of them and recycle things appropriately. But these messages are outside of the consumer experience. The message of reuse goes against the emotional consumer model that we've signed up for at the beginning of purchase. Repair becomes almost impossible through the complexity of devices and the warranties which are attached to those devices. And if we need to do recycling, we're going to have to do recycling in better, more engaged ways that allow us as consumers to break apart things and be engaged in that process to make sure we break things apart accurately. How are we going to do that? We need to engage people with a consumer life cycle that's we need to draw these messages together and make this consumer life cycle an emotional offboarding experience. We need to use the same language and tools as onboarding, and it needs to be inside the customer life cycle, not outside, speaking to the civil self, but we need to attach the consumer self. I can't really sign up for a message which is a sustainable consumer has to buy more stuff. I believe a sustainable consumer needs to have an ending and reflect on their actions, and it has to be attached to the beginning of the consumer life cycle. So what would a good closure experience be? I believe it's attached. It's consciously connected to the rest of the experience through emotional triggers that are actionable by the user in a timely manner. Let's dig into some of those. Consciously connected. So this is Epsom's Paper Lab. It's a paper pulping station, which is meant to be in your office. I guess it's not a home office, it's probably a legal office, because it's obviously enormous. You can put old bits of paper in one end, and it's going to pulp it there and then and bring out new bits the other end. You can see it there and then. Where a lot of our recycling experiences of paper recycling at home, the office is usually put it into a paper recycling bin that gets picked up. It goes on a truck off to the pulping station, gets put into reams, then cut into different A sizes, and then puts into a stationery company who repackages and sends it back to us. it's not a visible experience in that sense. This is seeing the ending of a product and its rebirth into a new product. It's a far more engaging emotional experience for the consumer. Emotional triggers. So this is Marie Kondo. She's a declutterer from Japan. I'm sure some of you might have read her book. It's really well worth reading, and I think has a lot to say about sustainability and consumption. So definitely recommend it. So she recommends to her customers to take out the clutter of their cupboards and stuff and put them into piles of subjects. So all your books, all your shoes, and all your coats, for example. And then you pick up each one and you say, does it bring me joy? And really ask that question, do I get delight from it? And if you don't, then you put it into a pile to be disposed of. And that pile to be disposed of, you go to and you pick up every one and you say thank you to it. So for example, some hiking boots, I'll pick up the hiking boots and I say thank you to the hiking boots for making me feel comfortable and allowing me to get grip as I climb up the hill. We are now going to say goodbye, and then you put them into the right containers. Now, when I say that to people in the West, it sounds crazy, but we say hello to things all the time. Saying goodbye can help bring emotional engagement and reflection about the consumption I've had. And it's an important aspect to start designing that into our consumer experiences. Actionable. Plastic bottle deposits. So I think these are great. And there's a question around this in the UK at the moment, thinking they should bring them in, which is a no-brainer, I think, for many people. It's insane that they don't bring them in already. So in Norway, for example, 97% of bottles are being recycled because they create a plastic bottle deposit scheme. So the consumer goes to the shop, buys a bottle, and on top of the purchase price, there's a deposit, a small amount. You then leave the shop, consume the bottle, and then you reclaim that deposit as you put it into one of these deposit machines. This is a wonderful experience because it connects the consumer between the onboarding experience and the offboarding experience. I'm engaged in both in an even way. It also allows this to be actionable to the consumer, which is encouraging. Timely. Kaya cars came to market about 10 years ago, and they offered a thing called the 7-year warranty. Now, up to that point, many companies were offering a product warranty, product quality warranty, which was more around 2 years. So a product would be good, like the ball bearings are good, or the door sounds really good. They didn't offer something that's 7 years. Now, this blew the market, and it was such a disruption. One of the things which I think is fascinating about this is one of the reasons why it's good, in my opinion, especially as a closure experience, is that people find it hard to think beyond 5 years. So when you start to say to somebody 7 years, you can buy this product and bring it back in 7 years, and you're basically inviting someone back to a funeral of that product. People can't think beyond that. That's 7 years is too far to think. You're basically suggesting product death. So when that person comes back in 7 years' time, they drive onto the forecourt of Kaya, and then they park up. Kaya can then reclaim those materials, have a really wonderful discussion with that consumer about how great that 7 years were, and they're probably very fertile for another sale. And so you've got this great ending to that product experience. So what can you do about it? Well, I hope, and many things. These are some of the suggestions and some of the things that I put forward in some of the workshops I do. So think about it. Hopefully, I've given you some food for thought around like what endings are and how closure experiences work, and you've been inspired by that. And you can get the book and go onto the website and have another look at certain aspects of it. I also hope you can go and talk about it to some of your colleagues. Now, this is going to be a lot more difficult than you imagine. I've been trying to talk about endings and consumer experiences for a long time, and it's really difficult. We're in a society and certainly a business culture which isn't very tolerant to think about consumers leaving an experience. And with that, it becomes quite upsetting to discuss it. But you can do some practical steps, and this is some of the stuff we also do in the workshop. So you can audit what you've currently got. Do you have a conscious ending in your business, in your product experience? Is there anything beyond the legal accepted endings that you would think? You can start asking these questions. Who is empowered at the moment of transaction? Now, as a consumer, you might be empowered, but also as businesses, we sometimes lock out the consumer so they're not empowered. How does the product service descend? How does that get revealed, that offboarding experience? Are they acknowledged at the beginning of that offboarding experience? How do you hand back aspects of it? How do you dismantle it? What type of ending do you have? And do you have an aftermath target? We often talk about focusing on target users, but we never think about the aftermath target of that experience. What's that consumer going to walk away with? How do they feel emotionally about it? Well, we're too busy getting the next new customer. They have to live with that experience for the rest of their life, potentially. You can also map your current consumer experience, and as you might in a film genre, you can see how a projection of what the proposal is of that consumer experience is at the very early stages. That would be advertising. And then you get something like a commitment, which is things like T's and C's, and that first use component out of the box. But we very rarely think about what's the last use of that product. How does that product break apart? How do you hand back data and relinquish control of that consumer? How do we provide them an opportunity to reflect about that experience they had? Was that a nice experience? Another aspect is planning it in. And I think this is a really important part of getting that into your product early on. I recommend just a fraction of time, 5% of your project time. You can think about how your product or service is going to end. If you think about 5 years out, for example, that's almost certainly going to have a component of product death. And of course, we can think about how it's designed. It's going to be consciously connected to the rest of the experience through emotional triggers that are actionable by the consumer in a timely manner. And that's the end. Now, the book's on Amazon. You can go and get that at any point. And there's also ebooks on iBooks, Smashwords, and Amazon. I hope you enjoyed it. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Joe.
I realise I'm a little bit early, I think.
No, you're bang on. We have a short gap between talks. I just wanted to say thank you very, very much for that fantastic and thought-provoking talk. I was going to plug your book again there. Your book is fantastic. I've just got it this week, and then I'm enjoying it, and I'm enjoying anticipating watching its life cycle as I pass it around my friends and colleagues as well. So thank you. Your workshop, is that happening at any other UX conferences near our attendees in the future? Can they watch out for that?
I haven't got it was on one. I'm talking to a few. This time of year is very much talking to different people and organizing it into different sections. So I'm just organizing it. I'm doing it potentially at a few different companies. They're going to be in the West Coast probably, so I'll be about on the West Coast of the US in the next few months. So hopefully catch up with some people then. If you're interested in me coming into either somewhere in San Diego or somewhere in San Francisco, I'm happy to pop in and do the talk there. or even run a workshop, but they're a little bit more effort on the business side. So yes.
Super. Well, I know we have some West Coast people listening in today, so do take notes. You people, particularly in Seattle, cough cough, and I know there's a San Diego contingent listening in as well from the ticket sale. So watch out for that. Joe, thank you very much again. Thank you very much for giving your time today, and for really just basically taking the last few months off to really delve into this topic. It's an important topic. You've written a fantastic book about it, and so we thank you for that.
Thanks very much, and thanks for you and Jen for organising all this. It takes a lot. Wow, that's impressive. Just dropping that again.
Just a bit about
thanks very much.
Thank you. All right. Bye, Joe.
Bye.
Bye. Okay. So thanks to our last speaker, Joe McLeod there. Do check out his book. It really is great. And that talk was awesome as well. I think more talks need to have slides of medieval plagues and misery, just to remind us how lucky we are in our future bubble here. And we're just going to pause here for a couple of minutes as we get our next speaker onto the stage. At 9:50 Eastern Time, we'll be welcoming Dr. Amy Bucher. So we're just going to have a 1 minute pause here, and then I'll introduce her. Okay, so I'm going to start introducing our next talk here. Let me put over the camera. We should be able to see Amy's top slide. So just a quick word of introduction from me. Our next talk is Planet as Patient, What Conservation Can Learn from Health Psychology, with Dr. Amy Bucher. Dr. Bucher is a Behavior Change Design Director at MadPow, and this talk is going to cover how behavior change science can influence counterproductive behaviors in the individual, communities, and at national levels. Amy, are you with us?
I am. Can you hear me?
I am. Hang on, I've realized I haven't actually shared your screen properly. There we go. Perfect. That should now be going out. We can hear you, and hopefully now we can see your slides as well.
All right. Excellent.
Take it away.
Thank you so much. And thank you, everybody, for joining today. Sustainability is a topic that I've become really passionate about. Looking back, I realize it's been an interest in my life for more than 25 years now, but recently it's become clear that psychology really has a role to play in affecting the way people behave around sustainable behaviors. So I'm very excited to start to get more active in this area and hopefully leverage my expertise and experience, which has mostly been in the realm of health, to help make the world a greener place. So I want to just start off by talking about motivated people and what is motivation, because I think it's really important to understand this anytime we're talking about behavior change. One definition of motivation that I like a lot is that it's desire with velocity. It's this idea of wanting to do something. And without motivation, which is what you see over here on the left-hand side of the scale, amotivation, you're not going to get any sort of sustained behavior in a person. There really needs to be some sort of fuel for behavior in order for it to take place repeatedly over a period of time, especially the sorts of deliberate behaviors that make up sustainability. So you think about the sorts of conscious choices that people have to make in order to have sustainable behaviors. So if you think about motivation, there are many different types of motivation, and this comes from a theory called self-determination theory of motivation. But you can really think about them as along a continuum. So as I mentioned, all the way on the left there is amotivation, or a lack of motivation entirely. And when you find people who are in that situation, chances are they are not ready for behavior change. They are very difficult to influence. And so typically with behavior change interventions, we don't focus very much on those people. Then you have your externally motivated people. So a lot of people are familiar with the phrase extrinsic motivation, which comes from some sort of external reward, or sometimes it's a punishment as well. If you think about somebody nagging you to do something, that is an extrinsic motivator. And that can get people to make a behavior change. But that type of behavior change tends to be very vulnerable to obstacles. So if you think about health psychology, a lot of people will make changes to their diet after visiting their physician and hearing that they're overweight or they have some sort of other alarming health indicator. And they may be pretty good about their new eating habits until it's really easy not to be. They're out with their friends and there's peer pressure to eat the hamburger, or they're alone and nobody knows that they're having a donut. So external motivation can get people to do things, but it typically is very vulnerable. And then the next step on the continuum is what you call introjected. And this is really the same thing as extrinsic motivation, but it's when you start to carry those nagging voices around inside of you. You can tell that somebody is introjected motivated when they say things with a lot of shoulds. I should, or, oh, I'm being bad. And again, that will get people to make some changes, but it continues to be very vulnerable to obstacles. From there, you get into what we call the more autonomous forms of motivation, and these are really the more self-generated and the more durable types of motivation. So identified is when a person has a goal or something that they value, and they see behaviors as being consistent with that. So they may not really value the behavior in and of itself, but they really care about the goal that they see as being a consequence of that behavior. From there, you have integrated, and this is now where you start to think of that behavior as part of who you really are. So again, this doesn't necessarily mean that you like or value the behavior per se, but you care a lot about what it means about you to do it or not. And I think if you think about sustainability, actually, you can really see here the potential to help people think about themselves as future thinking individuals who care about the next generation, who value taking care of limited resources that we've been provided. And therefore, when they're making decisions in their daily life, that's something to keep in mind. Then finally, the holy grail of motivation is intrinsic motivation, where you choose to do a behavior because it just genuinely feels good. There's pleasure in that behavior itself. I'm of the opinion that you very rarely see this in a lot of the formal behavior change type work that people do around health and financial services and now sustainability. This really tends to be more pure pleasure type behaviors, but it is, in fact, the most invulnerable type of motivation. So as we think about influencing people and changing their behaviors, the goal is to move them as far along this continuum as possible towards autonomous motivation, because that's where long-term change happens. That's where the motivation is able to weather bumps in the road and overcome obstacles. So from here, I'm going to talk about a public health example of behavior change has been quite successful. I'm going to point out along the way the things that happened at an individual and a societal level that helped move people closer to this right-hand side of the motivational continuum. So the public health success story that I'm going to talk about is still in progress. It's not a battle that's totally won. And in fact, many people, if you just ask them without context, would say that this is still a significant societal problem. But in fact, as I'll show you, we've made a real significant amount of progress in the last several decades. So what am I going to talk about? It's smoking, tobacco smoking, and getting people to quit cigarettes. So as I mentioned, especially depending on where in the United States you live and who your social group is, you may still perceive this as something that's a significant problem. And in fact, there are quite a few Americans who are regular tobacco smokers. But in fact, the smoking rate has declined very significantly since the 50s and 60s when it was at its peak. So this is a graph of smoking prevalence in the US over time, and you can see in 1964 is when it was at its highest. It was at about 43% of all American adults smoked cigarettes regularly, which is just staggering. I mean, that's nearly half. In 2015, which is the most recent CDC data, you can see that it's down to about 15% of American adults. So over 50 some years, we've seen two-thirds of the smoking population drop, and you can see it's been almost linear over time. So that's actually pretty good. So what can sustainability learn from what's happened in terms of smoking cessation and the psychological tactics that were used there? The first is around creating awareness, and I'm kind of excited to get to talk about this because with a lot of health behavior change, this is actually no longer a really effective tactic. And why? Because we've been running the same campaigns for so many years, for decades even, that it's hard to create new awareness. And in fact, people hear, you know, smoking kills, you know, eating saturated fat is not good for you. I get it. And it almost has a reverse effect when people have heard the message so many times. But I think with sustainability, we have an opportunity to create awareness around a topic that people really don't know that much about yet, that we're really still actively learning about as a community. And smoking once was that way as well. So this is a screenshot of the cover of the Surgeon General's report to the advisory committee about the state of smoking in the United States. And believe it or not, so this is from 1964, and it was the first really well done research document that was able to conclusively say cigarette smoking causes significant health problems. So before that, even though it feels intuitive now, 50 years out, to say, yeah, cigarette smoking is bad for you, they really didn't have the scientific consensus around that. So this was the first time that they were able to do that. And as a result of this report, there started to be more education in general in public around the consequences of smoking. And you can see in the graph on the right, the report came out right where the red arrow is, 1964. And if you remember the smoking rates that I showed you, that was the height of smoking in the United States. From that time, smoking began to linearly drop in the United States. And a lot of that initially was due to the fact that people were learning for the first time that smoking was truly bad for their health, that it was tied to these really negative long-term consequences. I think we have a similar opportunity with sustainability to start to create that awareness around some of the decisions that people make in their daily lives and the longer-term consequences for them and for people they care about. One of the things that we can do, even when information is kind of old hat, when people do know what's going on, is we can help to frame it in ways that are consistent with their values. So I mentioned before that you can get a backfire effect sometimes if you say to somebody, smoking kills. And I think we've probably all seen this with people we know in our own lives who smoke. It doesn't really do a lot of good to remind them of the public health problems with smoking. But what sometimes I've seen work, especially with women or people who are really interested in their appearance, is focusing on some of the appearance-related consequences of smoking. So the fact that your fingers might look yellow from holding a cigarette, or that you'll get a certain wrinkle pattern around your mouth that as you age isn't the ideal of beauty. So talking about those sorts of things is more consistent with values that those particular individuals have, and it can help them to change their behaviors. When you think about sustainability, one of the things that I've been really interested in watching, especially around politics and sustainability, is that you sometimes see these groups who you would expect to support non-sustainable industries or technologies actually moving the other way. And I think what's happening there, and where there's a lot of promise, I think, is that they're understanding that more sustainable. So for example, if you look at truckers, there are contingents in the trucking industry that are very interested in sustainable fuel sources. And I think that those people have started to realize that moving towards more sustainable transportation methods is actually consistent with their long-term values of maintaining a job, maintaining a place in the industry. We're keeping with the status quo of the technology over time. It may be good right now, but 20, 30 years down the road, it may mean that their job is no longer there for them. So by thinking about the issue in terms of things that they value that are personally meaningful, they come around to a different point of view. The second psychology-based tip that we've seen with smoking cessation that I think has a lot of potential for sustainability is adding in social dynamics. So we all live embedded in social contexts at multiple levels, from our personal and family relationships to our workplaces, to our towns and cities, then to our larger cultures. And at every one of those circles, we are affected by the way that others around us behave and the things that are considered to be the social norm. So that gives us a lever of influence when we think about sustainability. In terms of smoking, I love this example just because it harkens back to my childhood. This is an illustration from Ramona and Her Father by Beverly Cleary, when the main character, Ramona Quimby, is trying to get her dad to quit smoking. She creates all of these signs and posters and hangs them around their house. And her, her line breaks are perhaps not great, which gives her dad an opportunity to make some jokes about Nosmo King and who is that. But I always think about this and about how at the family level, children have actually played a really important role in getting their parents to quit smoking. That's a dynamic you saw a lot through the 70s and 80s as there was education at the elementary and high school level. So kids are hearing about how bad smoking is, and they're coming home and watching their parents light up. And they're speaking up and saying like, hey, listen, I love you and I don't want you to do this. So that actually, for a time, was a really effective lever of change. And I think there's an opportunity there as our younger generations are growing up in a world where sustainability is becoming more the norm, and they're being exposed to a smarter science around that. You also see this at an adult level. So this is data from a peer-reviewed study. It was done with the Truth Foundation. So they have an online smoking cessation program called Become an X. It is aligned with the Mayo Clinic, so it follows a clinically validated protocol for smoking cessation. And it has this online community. So, essentially message boards, and you're able to connect with others online and share your stories and give advice. And so they conducted a study of their own users, and they were able to look at people who either didn't use the community at all, who used it passively. So these are your lurkers. They're going online, they're reading, but they're not posting or responding. And then active users. And what was really interesting when they looked 3 months out who had successfully quit smoking, people who even just lurked in the community were more than 3 times as likely to have quit smoking 3 months out. That feeling of belonging to a bigger group of people who were working on this goal together was really helpful in helping them make this difficult change and sustaining it over 3 months, which is pretty significant. I mean, people who quit smoking, they fail time and again. It's one of those changes that takes a lot of attempts to stick. So to see people successful 3 months out at a 15% rate, that's really quite good. So again, I think there's a lot of promise here in terms of influencing individuals through their social circles and their communities. The next one is substituting means to the end. And that's really because many of the behaviors we do, and this gets back to the motivational continuum I shared as well, they are in service of another goal that we have. So with smoking, there are a lot of reasons that people smoke, aside from the physiological addiction, which is a very real thing. But they have other reasons why they have decided to become smokers or why they've decided not to attempt to quit. And one of those that you see quite a bit is that smoking is a social activity. People take their smoke breaks together. You may be going out to the bowling alley or the bar, and that's where you and your friends all light up together. So it's part of this larger social context, and it's a way that you bond with your friends. So you think about how habits are made. This is the habit cycle. There's some sort of trigger. In the case of the smoking example I just gave, maybe it's you see your buddy at the bowling alley, and that is your cue that it's time to pull out the cigarettes because that's what everybody's doing. You take your action, which is smoking a cigarette, and then you get the reward, which is both the the burst of nicotine that feels good at a physiological level, but also that bonding with your friends. If you can replace anything in this cycle, that gives you the power to start to change the habit. And so one of the things that we've seen with smoking, and I'll show you a little more about this in the next one, is that by making it harder to take the action of smoking in these common trigger situations, we've really been able to reduce the number of people who smoke. And when you give people advice about quitting smoking, a lot of times it's around how can you create a different situation for yourself? So instead of going to the bowling alley that allows smoking with your buddies, can you guys choose to go to a different location? Can you go see a movie together? Could you do something to bond that's different from smoking? Maybe you order the big plate of nachos. So again, you just think about what are people actually getting out of the behavior? And is there something else that you can substitute that will help them get that same effect? With sustainability, by the way, I think oftentimes the benefit that people are getting, the reward, is the expediency of it. It's easier to do things that are not environmentally friendly. That's just the default path, and it's much easier for me to take it. So I think here an opportunity really is to make the sustainable choice an easier choice. Next is changing barriers and facilitators. So these are the things that enable people to take a behavior or not. And I previewed this a little bit. But one of the big changes that we've seen in the United States over the last several decades is where people are allowed to smoke. So as of the last time I checked, which was in the last few weeks, 36 states in the United States have completely banned smoking in restaurants and bars. And what you've seen when that happens is that the smoking rate actually drops, because as it becomes harder for people to smoke, they're less likely to do it. And additionally, what this visible no smoking ban does is it creates that social pressure and that attention to the smoking behavior that wasn't there before. So it's really helping to work on multiple levers. As a counterpoint, the Truth organization that I mentioned before, Truth Initiative, they have identified they're about in the middle of the United States that have the highest smoking rates in the US. So I showed you before that 15% of all Americans smoke. It's much higher than that in these states and then much lower in some of the other states. What you find in these 12 tobacco nation states is that an average smoker is having 26 more packs per year than a smoker elsewhere in the US. And what you see happening at more of a facilitator level is that cigarettes are cheaper there. These are states that have chosen not to tax cigarettes to the same extent that other states have. So the cigarettes are much more affordable, and as a result, you see people smoking them more. So this is where those public health efforts around taxing and policy have really affected the behavior that people take. And again, I think that there are some opportunities here for sustainability as we start to think from a regulatory level. What are we doing to enable sustainable behaviors? What are we doing to make those choices more affordable, more convenient, in some cases, clearly preferred by legislation? Those will really affect the prevalence of sustainable behaviors. So to sum, the four big things that I have for behavior change lessons for a sustainable future are, first of all, creating awareness. And again, I think we have a real opportunity in this area where it is still relatively new. People are not tired yet of hearing the same old sustainability messages, and we have a lot of opportunities to experiment with different ways to talk about sustainability so that it's consistent with people's values. Adding social dynamics, and this does play with the changing barriers and facilitators, but working at different levels of society, influencing people like our young children who are in schools and helping them to understand sustainability and sustainability science from an early age so that they are joining the sphere of influence and starting to make it much less acceptable to behave in some of the old ways. Substituting means to an end, so starting to understand why people are engaging in non-sustainable behaviors and making it easy for them to make different choices. Changing barriers and facilitators, this is now thinking more at a societal level. How can we make it easier for people to do the right thing for the environment? And then again, I just want to underscore, because we think back to that motivational spectrum, it is important to respect individual autonomy. And I know that one of the big criticisms of some of the more regulatory pressure on sustainable behaviors, and you hear it with cigarettes, you hear it with things like soda taxes, is that it doesn't respect individual autonomy. I think there's room for argument there. It certainly does make certain choices more difficult for people. If you're asking somebody to pay more money to, put something in the trash as opposed to put something in the recycling, sure, that is putting your thumb on the scale of free choice. But I think that there are ways that you can still do that within a larger structure of respecting individual choice and values to help people feel like this is something they're opting into as opposed to being forced to do. So I think a lot of it here is going to be in the style. It's going to be the art combined with the science. I'm really excited to see what we can all do together to make it happen. So thank you all very much, and I'm really looking forward to the rest of the day.
Thank you very much, Dr. Amy. Oh, yeah. Let me try now. Okay, I think the echo is gone. I was saying thank you very much, Dr. Amy. Tons of food for thought there. Lots of applicable lessons for those of us engaged in both product design, communication design, and hopefully policy design and beyond. Dr. Amy did not plug her blog. It is amybucherphd.com. It's a fantastic resource for some of the techniques that you are hearing described there. So definitely go check that out. And you can work with Amy discover healthier behaviors for both consumers and beyond. So again, thank you, Dr. Amy. We're going to just take a short pause here while we get our next speaker onto the stage. I can see that she's just joining now, and we will be restarting in 5 minutes. Hi, Kristen. I see you've joined. Can we just do a quick sound check? How are you doing there?
Yeah, I'm doing well. Can you hear me?
I can hear you fine. And it looks like we can see your screen there. And great, I can see a full screen thing.
Slides?
Yeah, super.
All right.
Okay. So we've advertised you as coming on at 10:15. So we'll just take a short pause here, and then at 10:14, I'll come back and introduce you.
Okay.
And off we'll go.
Great. Thanks.
Super. Thank you. Okay, and we're back. So it gives me great pleasure to introduce our next talk, which is Digital Meets Physical, the Power to Influence Sustainable Behavior in Real Life, with Kristen Aldrich-Cheek. Kristen is an applied researcher, strategist, and advisor at Cornell. Her talk today asks, how can UX enhance our interactions with the physical world for a more positive impact on our environments and health? I'm just going to point the camera here. Kristen, over to you. You're still muted, by the way, so you need to unmute.
There we go. All right. Can you see my screen?
We can, yeah. So if you go full screen, you should be in great shape.
Okay.
All right, take it away.
All right. Thanks so much. I'm really excited. It's great to have an opportunity to talk to you today. So hello, everyone. And also just a big thanks to James, Jen, and Jen for organizing the conference. I wanted to just start by giving you a quick idea of my perspective, which is coming from a background in psychology and in community engagement. and strong interest in behavior in particular, and in environmental and public health issues. So I've spent a lot of my career working on human-environment relations in one way or another. And I've spent a lot of that time trying to convince people on the environmental side of things to be more human-centered. And with the growth now of human-centered design, I find myself talking more and more about finding some sort of balance between human-centeredness and nature-centeredness. And I'm also really interested in how design in particular influences behavior. And one thing that's clear is that how we use things, and by that I mean everything, including products and buildings and cities, how we use things influences resource use. But unfortunately, our actions are more and more separated from the impacts of those actions. So it's especially important as designers to look at context and design and how it influences behavior and environmental impacts. Which brings me to the digital and physical contexts. And today I want to talk about the connections between the two and the perceived divide between digital and physical worlds. And the reason is that digital-physical connection right is so important for our future and for environmental sustainability. So for a long time, we've struggled in terms of having a divide between humans and nature, a perceived divide where we see ourselves as separate from nature. And that's really at the root of a lot of our environmental problems. And now with a physical-digital divide, where we work very separately in physical and digital environments, and we often don't connect the impacts of our digital work and behaviors on the physical world, this is only going to exacerbate environmental problems more. So first, I'm starting with the premise that we need to think about that relationship between digital and physical, and that separateness in general tends to have negative implications for environmental sustainability. And then with the idea that digital designers have a powerful and growing influence over how we interact with our physical world. And so I'm asking then what digital UX can do to influence our interactions with the physical world for positive impacts on our environment and ultimately for our health. And I'm specifically talking about behavior and the implications of behavior, and the idea that what your users do in the physical world is based in part on their experience with your digital product. And I want to stop here and just make the point to not think in terms just of green products or sustainable behavior, because all behavior, all products, all choices have an impact, whether intended or not, right? So everything is connected. And you'll hear the word systems a lot as I talk, and that's a big part of what I want to bring to the discussion. So for designers, it's thinking about what that impact might be without necessarily categorizing something as green or sustainable. And so my aims for the next 15 minutes or so are to make the case for context, so that when we think about users and experiences and behavior and environmental impacts, we're thinking in terms of systems. And to talk a little bit more about this physical-digital divide and what it might mean. And ultimately, what I want to do today is to get us all thinking about how we can bridge the divide and bring our best methods and thinking to bear for environmentally sustainable solutions. So I want to get to context and behavior in complex systems, but often in trying to understand something, I think it's helpful to see it in relation to other concepts. So really, really briefly, in the next couple of slides, I'm going to give an overview of various models for studying human behavior, which are then the basis for interventions to change behavior. So this is a very simple look. But the first perspective here is the rational one, that we each weigh the costs and benefits of things, and then we make a reasoned judgment. And a lot of the focus here in terms of behavior change is on price. Another perspective is the social dilemma model. You see this used with things like overfishing. So how do we get people to change their behavior when the individual and collective interests don't align, at least in the short term? And then behavioral models with the idea that we can condition people to behave in certain ways, particularly with things like rewards. Most recently, a lot of attention has been on decision-making models and behavioral economics with the idea that we engage in two types of thinking, a slow, deliberate type, and a quick cognitive energy saving type that relies on shortcuts. And then interventions take these shortcuts into account to influence behavior. A lot of environmental research has fallen into the next category with a focus on values, attitudes, beliefs, norms, and motivation. The emphasis here is often on changing minds, using education and other means, and on social influence. And some of these models account for the physical context, but it's generally underemphasized. So we run into some common problems when we try to influence people's behavior. One major issue is a gap between what we think or believe and what we do, or even between what we intend to do and what we do. So even when we're successful at changing people's minds, that doesn't necessarily mean that behavior follows. One of the reasons for this gap is that a lot of what we do is routine. It's unconscious, it's shaped by our environment, and it's difficult to overcome habits. And then there are limits to what people can actually do, what they have control over. And if you've ever had a chance to play around with an environmental footprint calculator, you probably know that a lot of our personal impact is essentially built into the system. So when we make one choice, which might or might not seem to be environmental, there are all kinds of environmental implications. And I say this to highlight the power of design and the importance of systems. And then environmental psychology provides a little bit different view that emphasizes context and emphasizes environment. Environment here meaning the person's environment, not necessarily nature. And the idea is that behavior is often driven by factors outside of the individual, which includes the social environment and norms, but also the physical environment. And the relationships among those factors and the person is really what we're interested in. And one really major implication here is that design influences behavior. So we can think for a minute about an extreme example of that. This is a lockout-tagout device. It's used in situations where the stakes are high, when we want to make sure someone isn't electrocuted or injured by machinery being turned on while they're working on it. So in a situation like this, we don't rely on interventions that focus on changing minds. We very forcibly guide behavior. And you can think about this type of thing on a much bigger scale as well. So obviously we can't do this with everything, but it gives you a sense of using design to influence behavior or building a behavior in with the design, in this case, in the physical environment, or in the least, designing to support a particular behavior. And one of the tools that we use with environmental psychology is the bioecological model, which is a way of just conceptualizing the complex system that we live in. And it's really helpful for thinking about influence in behavior. It's essentially just a simple systems model. And what's important here is the idea that things are connected and have multiple influences. So when you're talking about complex problems, which environmental sustainability is, the best solutions are likely going to be addressing things at more than one level in the system. And just to give you an idea of what's in the system, the individual is at the center, and that includes things like our personal attitudes and beliefs and characteristics. And then we go out to the people and the products that we interact with, and where we live and where we work, and the larger societal forces and culture. And the great thing about a systems view is that it doesn't preclude any It also includes space for us to think about products and design. So what we know from decades of research related to sustainable behavior and why a systems model is so important, and this is a fundamental point that can't be stressed too much, is that context can often override personal variables. So we know that changing minds doesn't necessarily work in terms of changing outcomes. And that's because of the gap that we talked about. And also, again, that a lot of environmental impacts are built into the system, or the more impactful option is by far the easier thing to do. So we need to design a system that supports everyone's behavior sustainably. And given that, it's important to continue to question the context and how it drives behavior and environmental impacts, and consider whether there's a solution to be had in changing the environment. So if you're concerned with context, with the interaction between people and their environments.
I'm sorry, I'm really sorry to interrupt right here. We've lost your screen share, so we can't see your slides anymore.
Okay, sorry.
We were having an issue with that before as well, but it came back. Very sorry to interrupt the flow here. Are you able to reshare it? Let's see if that works.
Let's see. It says I'm sharing. Can you see anything?
Not at all. Do you think you could stop sharing and then share it again?
Yep.
No, nothing going there. Were you sharing the application or the whole window before?
The whole window.
Okay, that normally works okay. Okay, if that's not coming back, I've got to say your voiceover was doing an excellent job of filling in the details without the slides. So perhaps we'll just continue, and then we can maybe offer the offer attendees a chance to look at the slide deck after the show.
Okay. Do you think it would help to exit the Hangout and come back in?
Worth a try.
All right. So let me do that.
Thank you.
Yep.
Sorry, folks. We don't get too many technical hang-ups these days, but every now and then we get a doozy like this one. Okay, great. We can see your webcam. So you've rejoined. But we're not yet. Okay, now we're seeing a screen. Fantastic. Okay.
All right. Sorry about that. Can you see it now and hear me?
I can. And apologies purely on my part. We chose Google Hangouts because it's free and it uses renewable power, but occasionally it throws us a curveball like this one.
Okay. All right. So I was talking about context and changing behavior. And if you're interested in these kinds of things, and you're thinking about the interaction between people and their environments, and you're thinking in terms of systems, you quickly run into a problem when talking about influencing behavior and environmental impacts today. And that's that we live in both digital and physical worlds. But we treat digital and physical worlds very differently and very separately, which makes it difficult to address sustainability because we aren't looking at the whole system. So one of the things that really got me thinking about this was conversations I've had over the last several months with people who work in physical design and people who work in digital design. And there are a lot of parallels between the two types of work. Both are dealing with human behavior, both have implications for our environment. But the norm in each, generally, is to sort of stop at this imaginary boundary between digital and physical. And this is where I think UX can help, because there's a focus here on experience. And we know that human experience often blends and crosses between digital and physical environments. So there's a huge opportunity for people here who think in those terms. Now, if you ask what digital tools are out there to help people behave more sustainably, the answer is that there are a variety of digital solutions that were designed to directly and intentionally connect people with the physical environment for positive environmental impacts. So we have solutions that help people make purchasing decisions that have less impact. And then beyond purchasing, solutions that help people with actions they take less often, like recycling electronics. Solutions that save resources related to travel or help people save energy. And solutions that contribute to public and environmental health by encouraging people to report spills and other problems. And so in each case here, these are solutions that have a direct connection to a specific action in the physical world, which is great because it's really important to be thinking in terms of outcomes. And just to give you a couple of examples, this is Good Guide, which supports purchasing decisions. So you can look up specific products, or you can look at products within a category. You can learn about the environmental and other impacts of those products. This is eBird, which is an identification tool and also a citizen science tool So it not only encourages people to get outside and engage with nature, but provides data for scientists who are doing research on bird populations. And something that might be a little less familiar, drug disposal. So leftover drugs are both an environmental hazard and a public health problem. And one solution is to have people dispose of drugs in a safe place. So this is one of several digital tools that simply helps people locate a disposal site. So we asked what digital tools are out there to help people behave more sustainably. And right now, that's where the thinking is. How can we use digital tools to support environmental behavior? And so we see the digital piece as a tool to address a problem in the physical world. And then the challenge is laid out as first you have to capture people's attention and interest, which isn't easy. And then you have to convert that to action using that tool. And there are a lot of good things out there that support environmental behavior among people who are motivated to seek them out. But really, we need to be thinking bigger in the sense of impacts and systems, and smaller in the sense of every little thing that we do. And so the questions are really about how can we create solutions within everything that we do? Solutions that encompass a broader audience, including those who aren't necessarily seeking out environmental actions, but whose actions do have an impact. So how do we create integrated solutions? And I know that this is at a bit of a high level, so I wanted to go now to talk about what can be done in terms of your current work. And within UX, there's a huge diversity of people working on a lot of different applications, so there are a lot of different opportunities. So let's just think generally here about what can be done. And I think it starts by asking questions about how the experience drives resource use and thinking especially about unintended consequences. And one of the things that's particularly relevant to digital experience is asking, what does this make easy? So for example, how easy is it to order something online? And in some situations, it's easy enough to place multiple orders within a few minutes of each other separately, which are then shipped separately in separate packages with separate paper invoices and separate packaging. So there are real-world resource impacts stemming from a digital experience that's designed to be easy. Or how easy is it to turn on your lights when you're not at home, when you're not in a room, at the same time every day, regardless of your schedule? What are the unintended consequences of that in terms of energy use? And how might we change the design to address those kinds of impacts? Another way that might be helpful to think about unintended consequences and to identify opportunities is to push the idea of users out a bit, to include people that your direct user interacts with, the people who deliver products, the people who report to your user, whatever that situation is, thinking about the experiences and behaviors of those people and the associated environmental impacts. And then can we push things out even further in a way that makes it easier to identify and understand environmental impacts? One idea is to create a persona for Earth, or maybe one that's more local or specific. And the idea here is, how is the planet accounted for in the design process? And if you're having a participatory design process, how is that represented? We know from the development of green buildings and building design that the most successful environmental strategies are integrated in the process. They start at the very beginning. So they're not added on at the end as a question or as an attempt to mitigate impacts. So within UX, how can we find a way to integrate thinking about the environment in existing processes? So how can it really be built in? Another thing to think about is pushing for continuity beyond digital platforms to physical environments. So if you're mapping out an experience and thinking about where it begins and what steps people go through, it's considering the bounds of that activity. What do you include? And thinking about how some of those steps might take place in a physical space versus a digital space. And maybe mapping those connections out might reveal unintended consequences or opportunities. So again, it's pushing a little bit beyond where the process might be now to try to identify environmental impacts and think about the implications of the design. And what this means and what it doesn't mean is that it's not about going out and building a green app. So again, remembering that everything has some sort of impact and tapping into what you're already doing and what your users are doing. So how can you set people up for success in terms of environmental impacts in a way that's built into what you're doing and what your users are doing? And then finally, knowing that the lines will continue to blur and thinking about how you can be one of those people to build bridges, to work across boundaries. And this is just a really neat example of the blurring of those digital and physical environments and why it will make more and more sense as we go along to think in terms of systems. This is Keith Green's work on human-machine collaborative environments. So he's thinking in terms of integration of digital and physical and asking things like, instead of just having a computer in a room, how can machines be designed and integrated into our environments to help us? And so he's creating responsive environments that support people's work and learning and accessibility and creativity. And he's really talking about designing the technology and the physical environment together so that separation, that divide becomes less and less. So if you're thinking that you work in a digital space or you work in physical product design and you're comfortable with this clear boundary, consider what that might actually look like in 10 or 20 years and what the implications of that for your work are now. So I just want to end by saying that whatever you can do to bridge the physical-digital divide and to think in terms of systems will ultimately be in the service of environmental sustainability. And in the more immediate term, bringing in some simple tools that might help you identify unintended consequences or understand environmental impacts better, or by looking at a broader experience or a broader set of users, might bring to light opportunities to reduce impacts. And I really believe that the perspective UX designers have on human behavior and experience is a tremendous opportunity. There's a tremendous opportunity there to contribute to sustainable solutions. So thank you very much, and please do reach out. I would love to talk to people about these topics.
Kristen, thank you very much, and massive apologies there for the technical issues that we had during your talk there. Thank you very much for bearing with us.
Yep.
I'm afraid we did lose the slides again at one point. So I'll be reaching out to you to see if you'd be willing to share this slide deck with our participants. I did manage to share some of the slides to our Slack audience as well, so it wasn't all lost. And your voiceover did an awesome job in any case. But big apologies for the difficulties there. But thank you very much for joining us today. That was a really great talk, and thank you again.
All right, thank you.
Okay, everybody, as you've probably picked up if you're following along on YouTube, we've been having a few technical issues this morning. So we are going to take a quick pause here to make sure that, that we can show the next set of slides successfully. So go make yourself a cup of tea, and we'll be back in just a couple of minutes here. Hi, Amanda, I see you've just joined us here. And I can see your slides.
Hi, yeah.
So as you may have picked up, we've just been having a few technical issues this morning.
Yeah, no worries.
Which, well, they're completely inexplicable technical issues. So that's the worrying thing. Worst comes to the worst, we'll restart this Google Hangout and generate some new links for folks. What I'd like to do now, because our YouTube channel seems to be stuck pointing at the wrong window, so to speak. It's actually showing the avatar of my co-organizer Jen there instead of what it should be showing.
Gotcha.
And it's still doing that. Yeah, I'm worried I might have to restart here. Well, I'm going to just do a quick experiment of sharing out your screen and see if that takes over the broadcast. Let's give it a go here. So you can see your screen fine. No, it's not broadcasting.
Huh. Okay.
Okay, so there is a solution, but it's not pretty. We will have to end this Hangout and
Okay.
send you a new presenter link.
All right. Yeah.
And that also means for anyone listening, we're going to have to send out a new YouTube link as well. So this channel will end. If you go to Twitter, go to our Twitter channel, I will tweet out momentarily the new address for hopefully the rest of this conference. Cool. So thank you very much, everyone, for bearing with us during this. If anyone from Google's listening, please do file a ticket in your technical backlog there, and we'll be back in probably about 2 to 3 minutes. Amanda, I'm just going to email you a link now and end this broadcast. Thank you very much.